Welcome to SAM Conversation, a program of South Asia Monitor. It is our pleasure to welcome Mr. Dilip Sinha, former ambassador, whose latest book, Imperial Games in Tibet, is worth reading. It's very, very educative because the gobbling up of Tibet by China is something which has not been described enough or by written enough about by or written by enough scholars and writers. It's a catchy title. That's a very significant one. Imperial Games in Tibet, because Tibet was the result of the great game between the British and the Russians. And India is one of the countries which also got very, very seriously affected, and till date, it is suffering from the effects. And over the years, this great game has maybe, it's got another big player, the US, and another big player which was there, Russia, is not now immediately in the picture. It's the equation between India and Russia is different now. But I think all who refer to, in India, who refer to the India-China border need to be corrected. It is the India-Tibet border. 3,488 kilometers long and referred to as by India as the line of actual control. And if you take a larger look at it, it's from the Chinese side, it's a line of no control, or a line which they are trying to control. That's just a personal comment, but it's one which comes with having studied them from the time one was a schoolboy, and I had an elder brother who's in the army in 1962. I'll end soon. The Dalai Lama or Tibet, mention of Tibet, one is realized its experience very often. Discussing it with Chinese, they see it's like a red rag to a bull, particularly if it's a Chinese government official like army or a scholar sponsored by the government. In 1975, in Tulungla, Arunachal, there were 4 personnel of the 5th Battalion of Assam Rifles who were captured by the Chinese PLA. They were tortured to death. Mainly why? Because it is the 5 Assam Rifles Battalion which escorted the young Dalai Lama inside India, guarded and escorted him, and that is not forgotten by the PLA. I'll not. I'll briefly show some photographs which I have included in my book on China. These are from a book in 2022, China Bloodies Bulletless Borders. Anyway, I will not take any more time. Dilip sir, your book is very interesting and very informative.
Well, thank you for having me on your show. It's a great honor to be present, to be able to talk about my book, and to present the cause of our largest neighbor, Tibet, which is currently under Chinese occupation. As you have very correctly pointed out, we have never shared a common border with China. Our border historically was always with Tibet. It was only in the 1950s that the Chinese army got stationed on the India-Tibet border. Uh, India, of course, recognized Tibet as being under the suzerainty of China, but on account of this admission of India, uh, China not only claims Tibet, but also large parts of the Himalayas, the sub-Himalayan terrain, which has traditionally had uh, close links, religious links with the Dalai Lama and with Tibetan Buddhism. So it is regions like Ladakh and Sikkim and Bhutan and Arunachal Pradesh. These are all areas claimed by China. Uh, so we have to be extremely careful about the policy that we pursue in Tibet because it has implications for our own security. Now, Tibet has been historically our largest neighbor. You mentioned the length of our border. It has been historically the longest land border that we have had with any country. But what is interesting is that it has also been the most peaceful border because historically we never stationed any troops on this border. We didn't need to station any troops on this border because the border was very broadly defined as borders were in those days, and very few people crossed them. Never did an army cross across, perhaps except for one or two occasions, which are negligible in this long history that we have had. And historically, our relations with Tibet have been extremely close. So close, in fact, that the longest serving dynasty in Tibet, which served from about 2nd century BC to uh, the 8th century, 9th century CE, that dynasty called the Yarlung dynasty, according to Tibetan tradition, was founded by a member of the family of Mahatma Buddha. That is the kind of linkage that Tibet sees with India. And of course, subsequently, uh, Buddhism traveled from India to Tibet, and uh, all the Tibetan scriptures are translated from Sanskrit and Pali into Tibetan, and not only translated to Tibetan. Historically, Tibetans have very close links with their northern neighbors, Mongolia, the Manchus, to a certain extent, even China. And the Buddhism that traveled to Manchuria and to Mongolia was through Tibet. It was the Tibetans who, who translated their texts from Tibetan into their languages. And that is how Tibetan Buddhism spread into other parts of Central Asia. In China, Buddhism went both directly from India, across from eastern Turkestan, through people like Huensang, Xuanzang, whom we all know about, but also separately through Tibet. So it is this, but today China claims to monopolize Buddhism, and it claims that Buddhism actually is indigenously Chinese, and Tibetan Buddhism is an offshoot of Chinese Buddhism, which really is a mockery of history. So it is very important for us in India to understand our historical links with Tibet, our cultural links with Tibet, and of course the fact that when Tibet was attacked by China in 1950-51, uh, the people of Tibet looked to India for help. And then 8, 9 years later, in 1959, when Chinese forces carried out a very brutal repression of the uprising in Tibet, then the Dalai Lama and thousands of Tibetans fled to India and they took refuge in India. And China has never forgiven us for giving shelter to the Dalai Lama. You mentioned about the 1962 war. That came just 3 years after uh, India gave shelter to the Dalai Lama. So China wanted to slap India in the face for this action of hostility, or perceived hostility to China. And that China has never forgotten. And China continuously now not only sees the Dalai Lama both as a spiritist and occasionally as a terrorist, and also keeps claiming Indian territory. So we have to formulate our Tibet policy very, very carefully, keeping in mind both the interests of our large neighbor, which looks to India for help, for spiritual inspiration and guidance, but also for our own national security.
Thank you, Dilip Sahab. One has had the opportunity to visit 4 or 5 uh, places in India where there are Tibetan settlements, like Pathankot, Dalhousie, McLeodganj, uh, Dehradun. Dehradun, uh, there's a place called Amdo Tibetan, and it's an eatery. And Amdo is a very, uh, you know, um, very significant word. And in all 4 of these places in the early 70s, when I had the opportunity of going and visiting these places, it was um, also for the pleasure of eating chow chow and momos and thuppa, um, Tibetan dishes which you get in their eateries. Um, one met about 5 at least veterans of the China-Tibet War. That very fierce confrontation which they had, and a couple of them showed photographs of their very young version of themselves with with a revolver or a weapon, a photograph. Uh, they 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 shared, briefly some of their experiences when one asked them. Uh, we in Delhi also, one has had the opportunity of interacting with um, their officials of the government in exile. Otherwise, I think the most common news that one hears about uh, them is of still being exploited in so many ways, of so many of them monks committing suicide, uh, of the PLA. The PLA is even trying to now, incorporate them in their army, and the way they are being exploited within China, in all kinds of um, in all kinds of forms. It is sad, but it's a fact. What all are you will say, the most um, outstanding or highlighted points about your book?
Well, I got into the writing of this book essentially because I felt that in the discourse that we were having in India, or we have in India, on India China relations, with the focus being on what we call the India China border dispute, we ignore the most important factor, which is Tibet.
Yeah, exactly.
Most books that I have read, written either by Indians or by foreigners, on India China relations focus on what they call the India China border dispute. And in this, they scrutinize with a very fine tooth comb India's claims. They pick loopholes in those claims and they say India's claim is weak. Therefore, China's claim is correct. And they accept China's claim as QED, conclusion reached. They do not examine China's claim. So I started looking at China's claim. And then I found that there is, after all, there is Tibet in between. And the Chinese army historically has crossed the Himalayas only once, and that was in 1793 when the Emperor Qianlong, who was a Manchu emperor, he had sent an army at the invitation of the Tibetans because Tibet was being continuously raided by the Gurkha rulers of Nepal. So the Tibetans got very disturbed and they asked the Qianlong emperor, who was also a Buddhist and a patron of Tibetan Buddhism, to send an army. So he sent a Manchu army led by Fukan Khan, who came down from Beijing, crossed Lhasa, came down, crossed the Himalayas, and then threatened Kathmandu. This was in 1793. And then the ruler of Nepal accepted the terms. he also accepted the terms. The peace treaty was signed, and he withdrew. That was one occasion. And the first occasion when a Chinese army had crossed the Himalayas and entered not India but Nepal. The second occasion was in 1910 when the governor of Sichuan province, a person called Chao Er-fang was a very brutal governor of Sichuan, and he had been appointed by the Manchu emperor in the dying days of the Manchu dynasty, Manchu rule in China. And he invaded Lhasa, butchered a lot of people there, and then his troops also crossed uh, into Arunachal Pradesh. Now, this disturbed the British, and they decided that they would need to draw up the border between India and Tibet. And of course, subsequently, Chao Er-fang, the Manchu dynasty was overthrown. There was a Chinese revolution. The Manchu dynasty was overthrown, and Chao Er-fang was killed by the people. And the 13th Dalai Lama declared independence in 1913. When he declared independence, the British decided that the border between Tibet and India, at least in the northeast, must be defined. And they called the representative from Tibet and the representative from China. China at that time was in civil war. So they picked up one of the two governments in China, recognized it 2 weeks before the conference started, called them over to India. And this was the Shimla conference. And the outcome of it was a tripartite agreement which decided the McMahon line. The Chinese did not negate the significance of the Shimla agreement. The British, of course, followed a very, very, very dubious kind of policy where they called the Tibetan representative to India, had him sign the agreement as a high contracting party, but the agreement also says that Tibet is under the suzerainty of China. And this was part of the agreement, and this is where the title of my book comes, The Imperial Games in Tibet, because the status of Tibet was decided by Britain and Russia. Britain and Russia were fighting for supremacy in Central Asia, right across from Iran to the northeast of Asia. And Britain was trying to ensure that Russia did not come anywhere close to the British Empire in India. So in 1907, they came to an agreement by the Manchu rulers of China. But the Manchu dynasty had subsequently become very weak. In the 18th century, the Manchu China, the Chinese Empire under the Manchu or the Qing dynasty, was a very powerful and a very rich dynasty, probably the richest country in the world at that time in the 18th century. But in the 19th century, it had become very weak because Europeans were taking away concessions on in the Pacific Ocean side. The Russians were eating away into the north. So Britain and Russia decided that it was best to keep Tibet as a buffer, not between Britain and China, but between Britain or the British Empire in India and the Russian Empire. And both felt that keeping Tibet under the Chinese Empire was perhaps the best thing to do. The Tibetans also did not quite mind being under Chinese suzerainty at that time because the Manchu rulers were also followers of Tibetan Buddhism. They respected the Dalai Lama, they kept him in, they honored him. The fifth Dalai Lama, in fact, in the 17th century, had gone down to Beijing. And the Chinese emperor, the Manchu emperor, had welcomed him, built a palace in his honor, and asked him to help them organize the administration of the Manchu Empire. They also devised the Manchu script and helped the Manchus develop scriptures of Buddhist texts in the Manchu language. So the Manchu emperors greatly revered the Tibetan rulers. So Tibet did not quite mind being under the overall suzerainty of China because they did not interfere in day-to-day affairs in Tibet. But the situation changed under Chao Er-fang. When Chao Er-fang became governor of Sichuan province, he was for some reason extremely brutal, and he came in and he started trying to plunder Lhasa. And that is when the differences became very acute between Tibet and China. Even in 1950-51, when China invaded Tibet, some Tibetans felt that perhaps the communist China would not be brutal. They would also be like the Manchu rulers. They would respect Chinese autonomy. And in fact, if you remember, in May 1951, there was an agreement signed between Tibet and China, which is called the 17-point agreement, under which China agreed to respect Tibetan autonomy, agreed to respect the institution of the Dalai Lama, the Tibetan Buddhism religion, and the internal autonomy of China. But they could not respect their own commitments. And very soon they started repressing the people, carrying out cultural genocide. You talked about the repression. Tibetans estimate that nearly 1 million people have been killed in Tibet. There have been periodic
Yeah.
uprisings. And right now, there are boarding schools being set up where all Tibetan children are taken into colonial style boarding schools where they are only taught Chinese language, taken away from their families, from their parents. So that's the kind of repression that's taking place now. Earlier,
Trying to
before 2000,
trying
yeah,
to
so China,
convert them to
yes,
becoming.
there is a Hanification of Tibet. And earlier, Tibetans could come across through Nepal into India till about 2007, 2008. But lately, their numbers have come down to a trickle because China is fencing the border in Nepal, as you must have seen, and it
Yes.
is also building border villages to keep an eye on Tibetans trying to cross the border. So Tibet has become a prison where Tibetans are not allowed to come out, not allowed to meet their families, relatives, and Tibetans outside are not allowed to visit Tibet.
There are, you mentioned villages. There are about 800, I think, villages that they have, which are strewn across along the line of actual control, or the in India-Tibet border, which is the referred to as the disputed Sino-Indian border, but the India-Tibet border. Um, it's very alarming. Although very recently, in the last day or two, there seems to have been some stepping down. I'll believe it only if it happens on the ground. From what they did in 2020, which amounted to the second aggression by China. If the first aggression was in 1962, 2020, May and June were easily what could be termed as a second aggression, and much of what they grabbed then, uh, it is reported that they're going to de-escalate and try and get back to the pre May 2020 status. There's a book by Major K.C. Johore. I wonder if you've read that. It was actually about pre and post 1962. He was 94 when he wrote it, about 5 years ago. Um, he was from the Indian Frontier Administrative Service in the post independence days, and had was actually posted uh, in Tibet. He mentioned something about a lot of documents, a lot of records not being with us. Uh, is that so?
I'm not
You
about
know,
records.
what he was trying to bring out is that China often wins when they, refer to history, about, history of that period, pre and post independence, we of which we don't seem to have any records.
Well, nor to the Chinese. See, the first thing to examine is what is China's claim to Tibet. Now, China claims that Tibet is a part of China. The question is, when did Tibet become a part of China? Uh, Chinese historians themselves do not agree on when Tibet became a part of China. Some say it became a part of China under the Manchus, which means 18th century. Some say no, it became a part of China under the Mongols, that is the Yuan dynasty, which means the 13th century. So you go back 5 centuries. Some say it became a part of China under the Tang dynasty, which means you go back to about the 9th century CE or 8th century CE. Now the Chinese claim that it has been a part of China since ancient times. Now, what does ancient times mean? Nobody knows. Now, China claims that Tibetan language is a part of what they call the Sino-Tibetan family. Now, Tibetan is nothing like Chinese. It's a completely different family of languages.
Yes,
It
yes,
is closest to a family of languages you can call the Tibeto-Burmese family.
yes, yes.
People who speak Sikkimese and Bhutanese can understand Tibetan because they have been traditionally very close languages. So it's nothing like Chinese. And the Tibetan script was developed by Tibetan monks who came down to India, Tibetan Pandits who came down to India, and they prepared the script on the basis of the late Brahmi script of the Gupta period. So the script, if you look at the script, anybody who knows Devanagari script today or any North Indian script can easily see Ka Ka Ga Gha written there. It's that similar. The Tibetan religion, although Chinese claim that it has come from China, the fact is that if you look at all their textbooks, over 300 volumes are translations of texts from India. In fact, today, the teachings of the Buddha are, are best compiled in Tibetan because in India, a lot of the books were destroyed. And in fact, when Nalanda University was set on fire, a lot of the books were rescued by monks, both Tibetan and Indian, who took them to to Tibet. And in the 20th century, early 20th century, there was an Indian Pandit, Mahapandit called Sankrityan, Rahul Sankrityan, who traveled to Tibet and he collected many of these manuscripts and brought them to India. And these manuscripts are lying in Patna Museum today. So these manuscripts have been rescued from Tibet, and when the Tibetan monasteries were destroyed, a lot of the manuscripts were destroyed by the Chinese army. Now, China did not know anything about the border of Tibet and India. It was only after their army came into Tibet in 1951, their army moved into Lhasa in October 1951. And thereafter, they slowly spread themselves to the borders of Tibet. And they were shown by whichever Tibetans were prepared to collaborate with them, they were showed the frontier of where Tibet ended and where India started, which is how one of the first maps that the Chinese published of Tibet was, I think, in 1957 or 59. There was no map before that. And of course, Aksai Chin, they took because the traditional route between Xinjiang and Tibet was through Ladakh. But since Ladakh was under Indian control, they made a new road across Aksai Chin, which was a very unnatural road. And this road was built by the Chinese with Russian help because the Russians were very close in Xinjiang at that time. So their engineers came down and helped the Chinese build this road. And the first reports of this road, of the construction of this road through Aksai Chin, came actually in some British newspapers through Russian sources in 1952. So the Chinese slowly came in, they understood the terrain, and then by the late 1950s, they started asserting and defining their claim lines. But to date, they don't really draw a clear line of what they claim. They say that it's an imperial legacy. Of course, it's an
No, no,
imperial legacy,
yeah,
but
absolutely right.
but Chinese control over Tibet is also an imperial legacy.
When we in since 2020, we've had about 24 meetings, I think, co-commander level meetings, and it's now, like I said, I'll believe it only when it happens on the ground. Whatever has been reported in the last couple of days of a bit of de-escalation and reverting back to a pre May 2020 status. while on the one hand they're doing that, on the other hand they are arming themselves very heavily, with all indications of actually which show them preparing for a war which ironically they don't want to fight by firefights, but because in 1967 in some skirmishes that we had in Sikkim, um, at which time the difference was that in 62 we had an ancient rifle. In 67 we had a modern self-loading rifle, which we lost 67, they lost over 400. And it's after that that they pressed very hard that let's not fire at each other. So they're very, very shy about actual close quarter combat in which with firearms. However, what do you see as Tibet's future, which so far I'm afraid seems very bleak?
Well, Tibet's future, yes, it certainly looks quite bleak because China has become an extremely powerful country. It is the world's second largest economy. Militarily, it's extremely strong, and it is also extremely aggressive. So it is not willing to negotiate. You're talking about the border talks that have been taking place between India and China. Now, all that we have agreed upon in these 30 years of talks is to maintain peace and tranquility. We
Tranquility,
have not
yes. Oh,
made
yes.
we have not made any further progress than that. And even that tranquility is difficult to maintain because we lost 20 of our people in Galwan the other day
Yes,
of
yes.
brutal
Although
behavior
the
by the
result of
Chinese.
it was that the Chinese lost, it was reported as 43, then they lost, I think, 100 at least, if not more.
Okay, so we are uh, we are looking at the Tibetan people who have a government in exile, but no country in the world recognizes that government as a government in exile. Now, the United States has made some very small beginnings by passing an act, the Tibet Support Act or Resolve Tibet Act, in which they have recognized certain rights of the Tibetans. It's a very small beginning. India has so far not changed its policy on Tibet, recognizing that Tibet is a part of China. So the Tibetans have a very uphill struggle, but the geopolitical situation can change, and when it changes, there will be an opportunity. The real resistance of the people of Tibet comes from the resilience and the resistance of the people of Tibet inside Tibet, because they, despite being under a very brutal regime, they have been holding on to their faith in their culture, in their religion, in their nation, and it is this that is the real hope of the people of Tibet. The very fact that China is still so sensitive about opening up Tibet shows that it has not yet won the hearts and minds of the people of Tibet. So while it can claim that Tibet has been a part of China since ancient times, fact is that the Tibetans today do not recognize themselves as being Chinese, which is why China has to hold on to Tibet through brute force.
Mr. Dilip Sinha, thank you very much for a very, some very important facts about Tibet, which you've come out with, and I look forward to reviewing your book. It deserves to be read by all in India who have anything to do with our borders. Right from the politicians and all of us who deal with security. Thank you very much,
Thank
and
you.
all the
Thank you.
best.
Thank you.